My parents kicked me out when I got pregnant at 19, 10 years later. They couldn't believe who I had become. My mother looked at me standing in the doorway of the only home I had ever known, my suitcase in one hand and my other hand resting on a stomach that was just beginning to round, and she said the words that would follow me for the next 10 years. "You are not my daughter anymore." I was 19 years old. I had nowhere to go, $63 in my checking account, and a baby growing inside me that the father had already decided he wanted no part of. It was raining that night, the kind of cold October rain that soaks through a jacket in minutes, and I stood on the porch of my childhood home listening to the deadbolt turn behind me. I want to tell you right now, before this story goes any further, that if someone had shown me a photograph of my life 10 years later, I would not have believed it was me. I would not have believed the house, the company with my name on the door, the sound of my daughter laughing in a kitchen that belonged to us and no one else. I would not have believed that the same mother who turned that deadbolt would one day stand on my porch, shaking, needing something from me that money couldn't buy. But that night, I didn't know any of that. That night, I only knew the rain and the suitcase and the sound of a door closing on the girl I used to be. This is the story of everything that happened in between. Stay with me until the end, because there is a moment coming, I promise you, that will make every hard year worth it. My name is Emma Sanders, and before any of this happened, I was, by every outward measure, an ordinary girl from an ordinary town. I grew up in Cedar Falls, a small city where everyone's parents seemed to know everyone else's parents, where the biggest excitement of the year was the county fair, and where my family had lived in the same brick two-story house on Maple Court for as long as I could remember. My father, Richard Sanders, worked as an accountant for a manufacturing company downtown. He was a careful man, the kind who balanced his checkbook by hand even after the bank offered to do it for him, the kind who believed that life was a ledger and every choice you made was either a credit or a debit against your reputation. My mother, Diane, taught third grade at Lincoln Elementary. She was warm to her students, generous with the neighbors, active in the church choir, and at home, she was the keeper of a very particular idea of what our family was supposed to look like. We went to church every Sunday. We had dinner together every night at 6 o'clock sharp. We did not raise our voices in public, and we absolutely did not embarrass the Sanders name. I was the only child. That mattered more than I understood at the time, because it meant that whatever hopes my parents had for a family, for a legacy, for a story they could tell at church potlucks, all of that weight rested on me alone. I was supposed to get good grades, which I did. I was supposed to go to a respectable college, which I was planning to do. I was supposed to marry well, in time, after a courtship my parents approved of, and give them grandchildren in the proper order, after the wedding, not before. I didn't resent any of this as a kid. Honestly, I loved my parents. My father used to sit with me on the back porch on summer evenings and quiz me on state capitals, rewarding every correct answer with a butterscotch candy from the tin he kept in his shirt pocket. My mother used to braid my hair before school so tightly it made my eyes water, humming old hymns under her breath the whole time. I was, in a lot of ways, a happy kid in a stable home, and I want to be honest about that because this isn't a story about villains. It's a story about how love, when it comes with too many conditions, can turn into something that looks like love but doesn't act like it when it's tested. I didn't know yet how mine would be tested. I was just a girl who liked to read paperback novels under the covers with a flashlight, who ran track in the spring, who dreamed, vaguely, the way teenagers do, about a future that felt wide open and entirely mine to shape. I had no idea how soon that future would narrow down to a single hallway, a single doorway, and a single choice that would define the next decade of my life. By the time I was 16, life in Cedar Falls had settled into a rhythm I loved without ever quite noticing I loved it. I had my best friend, Sophia Ibarra, who I'd known since the second grade, back when she moved to Cedar Falls from Phoenix and cried on the playground because she missed the heat. We were inseparable by high school, the kind of friends who had a whole language of inside jokes, who could communicate an entire conversation through a single eyebrow raise across a classroom. Sophia's family was different from mine. Loud, affectionate, unbothered by mess. Her mother cooked enormous Sunday dinners and always set a plate for me without asking, and some part of me, even then, understood that I loved being in that house because nobody there was keeping score. I ran track for Cedar Falls High, the 400-meter, mostly, and relay, and there was a particular kind of happiness in that sport that I don't think I've ever fully replicated since. The pre-dawn practices in the cold. The specific ache in your legs after a good workout. The feeling of crossing a finish line and hearing your name shouted by people who loved you. My father came to every meet he could. He wasn't a demonstrative man, but I have a memory of him at a regional meet, standing at the fence with his hands cupped around his mouth, yelling my name so loudly that my coach teased me about it for a week. I made honor roll every semester. I was, without any real effort, exactly the daughter my parents had hoped for: biddable, hardworking, unremarkable in the ways that would have caused trouble, remarkable in the ways that made them proud. I remember overhearing my mother on the phone with her sister once, saying, "Emma's never given us a single gray hair," and feeling a small glow of pride that I still remember clearly, all these years later. I say all of this because I want you to understand what was actually lost when everything fell apart. It wasn't just a home. It was an identity. I had spent 16 years building a reputation as the good girl, the reliable one, the daughter who never gave anyone a gray hair, and I am telling you now, there is nothing more dangerous than tying your entire sense of self to other people's approval. Because the moment that approval is withdrawn, you don't just lose your standing. You lose the ground you thought you were standing on. But at 16, 17, even 18, none of that had happened yet. Life was homecoming dances and study sessions with Sophia at the kitchen table, my mother's slow-cooked pot roast on Sunday afternoons, my father's terrible puns that made my mother roll her eyes and laugh despite herself. It was, in every simple way, happy. And then, in the fall after I turned 19, I met a boy who would upend all of it, not because he was cruel or manipulative, but simply because falling in love, at 19, has a way of moving faster than the life you've built around yourself. Until one day you look up and realize you're standing somewhere you never planned to be. I met Tyler Brooks at the community college where I was taking classes my first year after high school, saving money before transferring to a 4-year university the following fall, or at least, that was the plan. He was in my intro to psychology class, sitting 2 rows ahead of me, and the first thing I noticed about him wasn't anything dramatic. It was that he laughed at the professor's dry jokes when nobody else in the room did, a genuine, unguarded laugh that made a few other students smile just from hearing it. I liked that about him before I even knew his name. There was an ease to him, an openness, that felt like the opposite of the careful, measured way I'd been raised to hold myself. We started talking because of a group project, the kind of forced pairing that either produces nothing or produces everything. In our case, it was everything. Tyler was 20, working part-time at his uncle's auto shop while he figured out what he wanted to study, funny in a way that snuck up on you, and kind in the small, consistent ways that matter more than grand gestures. He remembered that I took my coffee with too much cream. He noticed when I was tired before I said anything. He drove 40 minutes out of his way once just to bring me soup when I had the flu and couldn't leave my dorm room. My parents met him exactly twice before everything changed, and both times, my father was polite but distant, and my mother asked pointed questions about his plans, his major, his 5-year outlook, whether he intended to finish a 4-year degree. Tyler answered carefully, respectfully, but I could see afterward that he understood, the way I did, that he had not passed some invisible test. He wasn't the kind of boy my parents had been picturing for me. He didn't come from the right kind of family in their eyes. He worked with his hands instead of aiming, visibly, at a desk job and a corner office. I didn't care. I want to be honest about that. At 19, I was in love in the uncomplicated, all-consuming way you can only be in love once, before life teaches you caution. We spent that whole fall together, study sessions that turned into long drives with the windows down, late-night talks on the hood of his car parked at the edge of the reservoir, the two of us pointing out constellations neither of us could actually name. He told me, one night in November, that he loved me, and I said it back before he'd even finished the sentence, because I'd been waiting for weeks to say it first. I remember thinking, that winter, that I had found the person I was going to build a life with. I didn't know yet how quickly someday could turn into now, or how differently Tyler and I would each respond when it did. By February, everything in my life was about to change in a way that no amount of planning, no honor roll, no perfect attendance record could have prepared me for. I found out I was pregnant on a Tuesday in late February, in the single-stall bathroom of the community college library, sitting on the closed lid of the toilet with a test I'd bought 40 miles away in a town where nobody knew my mother. I want to describe that moment honestly, because I think people who haven't lived it imagine either total despair or, somehow, total joy, and for me it was neither. It was a kind of roaring silence. I sat there for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 10 minutes, staring at two pink lines, and the only thought that came to me clearly, again and again, was, my mother is going to kill me. Tyler was the first person I told. I made him drive out to the reservoir that same night, our spot, because I couldn't say the words in a place that felt ordinary. He was quiet for a long time after I told him long enough that my stomach dropped, thinking he was already pulling away. But then he took my hand and he said, okay, we'll figure it out. And for a few weeks, I believed him completely. We didn't tell anyone else. Not Sophia, not my parents, not his family. We were 19 and 20 years old trying to carry the weight of a decision that would reshape both our lives, and we did it the way young people do quietly at night, in parking lots and on phone calls after midnight, running through scenarios that all felt equally impossible. Keep it and tell our parents. Keep it and don't tell our parents until we had no choice. Consider not keeping it. I remember crying more in those 6 weeks than I had in the previous 6 years combined, not because I regretted loving Tyler, but because I could feel, even then, the ground shifting under a life I had spent 19 years carefully building. I started getting sick in the mornings by early March, and it became harder to hide. I lost weight instead of gaining it at first, my body rejecting most of what I tried to eat, and I remember my mother commenting at dinner one night that I looked pale, that I should see a doctor, never imagining how close to the truth she'd stumbled without knowing it. Tyler, to his credit in those early weeks, showed up. He came to my dorm with ginger ale and crackers. He sat with me while I looked up statistics on teen pregnancy that made my chest tight with fear. He said more than once, "We're in this together," and I held on to those 4 words like a life raft because I desperately needed them to be true. What I didn't understand yet, what I wouldn't understand for another few months, was that there is a wide, painful gap between a person meaning something when they say it and a person being able to actually live up to it when the reality of it arrives. Tyler meant it, I believe that. But meaning something and being ready to sacrifice your own freedom, your own plans, your own comfortable idea of your 20s, for it, those are 2 very different things. By April, I was almost 12 weeks along, running out of ways to hide it and running out of time before the decision would be made for me, because bodies do not wait for permission, and mine was already beginning, faintly, to show. It wasn't a dramatic confession that gave me away. It was a dropped bottle of prenatal vitamins. I had come home for what was supposed to be an ordinary Sunday dinner in late April, and while I was in the bathroom, my mother went looking for aspirin in my overnight bag and found the small orange bottle instead. I remember coming downstairs and seeing her sitting at the kitchen table with the bottle in front of her, turning it over and over in her hands like she was hoping it might turn into something else if she just looked at it long enough. "What is this, Emma?" she said. Not a question. A demand dressed up as a question. I have relived that moment more times than almost any other in my life. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen I had eaten breakfast in every morning of my childhood, and I watched my mother's face move through disbelief, then something that looked almost like grief, and then, finally, into an expression I had never seen on her before and would never fully forget, a kind of cold, controlled fury that was somehow more frightening than yelling would have been. "Sit down," she said. And I did, because 19 years of training does not disappear just because you're suddenly facing the biggest crisis of your life. She called my father in from the garage. I remember hearing his footsteps on the back steps, unhurried, and I remember the exact moment his face changed when he walked into the kitchen and saw my mother's expression, and then saw me, and understood, before anyone said a word, that something had broken. "Emma is pregnant," my mother said. Flat. Final. Like she was reading a headline instead of telling him about his own daughter. My father didn't say anything for a long time. He pulled out a chair and sat down slowly, the way older men sit down when their knees ache, though he was only 46 at the time. He looked at the table, not at me, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet in a way that scared me more than shouting would have. "How could you do this to us? Not to yourself. Not what are you going to do, or how are you feeling, or are you safe? To us." In that single sentence, I understood with total clarity what I was actually up against, not concern for me, not even, in that moment, love for me, but a wound to their pride, to the story they told about themselves and their family. To the ledger my father had been keeping his whole life, where every choice was a credit or a debit. I tried to explain. I told them about Tyler, about how much he cared, about how we were figuring it out together, about how I understood this wasn't the plan, but that I was still me, still their daughter, still the same girl who'd made honor roll every semester of her life. My mother cut me off before I could finish. "You have humiliated this family," she said. "Do you understand that? Everyone at church, everyone I work with, everyone who has ever looked up to this family will know that my daughter, 19 years old, unmarried, is having a baby with a boy from an auto shop." I remember the word humiliated landing in my chest like a physical blow. Not scared. Not sad. Not even angry, not yet. Humiliated, as though my body, my life, the person growing inside me, existed primarily as a reflection of them, a variable in an equation about their own standing in Cedar Falls. I didn't sleep that night. My parents didn't speak to me again after that conversation. My mother went upstairs and closed her bedroom door, and my father sat in the kitchen alone for hours, and I lay in my childhood bedroom staring at the ceiling, one hand resting on my stomach, terrified in a way I had never been terrified before, because for the first time in my life, I understood that the unconditional love I had always assumed was there might have had conditions all along. I just hadn't tested them yet. I had no idea that the worst part hadn't even happened yet. That would come 6 days later. The 6 days between my parents finding out and the night they put me out were some of the strangest of my life, not because anything dramatic happened, but because of how quiet the house became. My mother spoke to me only when necessary, in short, clipped sentences about logistics. My father barely spoke to me at all. We ate dinner at 6 o'clock sharp, as always, in near total silence, the three of us moving forks and knives like we were performing a play about a normal family instead of living inside the wreckage of one. On the 6th night, my mother called me down to the living room. My father was already sitting there, and I remember thinking, with a small, foolish flicker of hope, that maybe this was the conversation where things would start to get better. Maybe they'd had time to sit with it. Maybe they were ready to talk about how we'd move forward. I was wrong. My mother had a folder in her lap, an actual folder, like she'd prepared for a business meeting, and inside it were printed pages, information about options, about adoption agencies 2 hours away, about a program for unwed mothers run through a church in the next county. She slid it across the coffee table toward me without a word. "I'm not giving her up," I said. I remember my voice shaking, but I remember the words themselves coming out clear and certain, the first completely certain thing I'd said since that Tuesday in the library bathroom. I didn't know yet that I was having a girl. That detail came later, but somehow, in that moment, some part of me already knew. "Then you understand," my father said slowly, "that you can't stay in this house." I want to be honest, even now, 10 years removed from that night, some part of me still doesn't fully believe he said it. This was the man who had quizzed me on state capitals for butterscotch candy. This was the man who had screamed my name at track meets until his voice went hoarse. And in that living room, in a voice with no heat in it at all, he told me that keeping my daughter and staying his daughter were not both available to me. My mother didn't argue with him. She didn't soften it. She said, "We raised you better than this, and we will not have this family's name dragged through the mud because you couldn't control yourself. If you choose to keep this baby, you are choosing to leave. That's your decision, Emma. Not ours. That's your decision, not ours." I have thought about that line more than almost any other sentence anyone has ever said to me, because it's the sentence people use when they want to do something cruel and still feel like the reasonable one in the room. I went upstairs. I packed a suitcase with shaking hands, some clothes, my hairbrush, the photo of Sophia and me from junior prom, a paperback novel I never finished reading. I came back downstairs, and my mother was standing by the front door, arms crossed, and my father was still sitting in his chair in the living room, not looking at me at all. I said, "Please." Just that. One word, the whole plea contained in it. My mother opened the door. Outside, it had started to rain. "You are not my daughter anymore," she said. I stepped out onto the porch. I heard the door close behind me, and then the deadbolt turn, and I stood there in the rain with a suitcase in one hand and $63 to my name, 19 years old, newly homeless, newly disowned, with a baby growing inside me who, I made a promise to her right there on that porch, rain running down my face, was never, ever going to know what it felt like to be told she wasn't wanted. I called Tyler from a gas station payphone 2 blocks from my parents' house. My cell phone had died, and I didn't have the cord in my bag, and he picked me up 20 minutes later, soaked through, shivering and crying so hard I could barely get words out. He let me stay on his couch that first night, in the small apartment he shared with 2 roommates above a hardware store downtown. He made me tea I didn't drink and sat with me while I finally fell asleep near dawn. For about 2 weeks, I let myself believe that this was survivable, that Tyler and I would figure it out together the way we'd said we would back in February, that we'd find an apartment, that he'd pick up more shifts at his uncle's shop, that somehow, some way, we would build something out of the wreckage. I watched him change in those 2 weeks. Not all at once, it was subtler than that, a kind of slow retreat that I didn't want to see clearly because seeing it clearly meant admitting I was more alone than I'd let myself believe. He started answering texts more slowly. He started finding reasons to stay late at the shop. When I brought up looking at apartments, actual 1-bedrooms we could actually afford, he'd change the subject or say, "Let's talk about it this weekend," and then the weekend would come and go and we wouldn't. The conversation that ended it happened on a Tuesday, exactly 1 month after I found out I was pregnant, sitting in his car outside my old dorm because I'd asked to grab a few things I'd left behind. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the steering wheel, both hands on it even though the car wasn't moving. "I'm not ready for this, Emma," he said. "I'm 20. I thought I was, but I'm not. I can't." He stopped. Started again. "My mom thinks I should focus on figuring out school. I think she's right." I remember asking him, my voice climbing toward something between begging and disbelief, what that meant, what it meant for me, for the baby, for the plan we'd made 100 times in that same car at that same reservoir. He said he'd help out when he could. He said he wasn't disappearing completely. He said all the soft, vague things people say when they're trying to make an abandonment sound like a compromise. I got out of the car. I didn't slam the door, I remember that specifically, some small part of me still too well trained to slam a door, even then, and I stood on the sidewalk and watched him drive away, and I understood, standing there with one hand on my stomach and the other wiping my face, that I was now doing this completely alone. Not just without my parents. Without him too. I want to say something here for anyone listening to this who has been where I was. It is possible to still love someone and understand, in the same breath, that they are not capable of showing up for you. Tyler wasn't a monster. He was young and scared, and he made a choice that a lot of young, scared people make. He chose his own comfort over someone who needed him. I don't carry hatred for him anymore. I carried something much heavier for a long time, though, the particular grief of loving someone who decided you weren't worth the sacrifice. But that Tuesday afternoon, standing on the sidewalk outside my old dorm, all I felt was the ground disappearing from under me one more time. Parents gone. Boyfriend gone. A baby coming in 7 months. $61 now, after the gas station coffee I'd bought that morning I could no longer really afford. I had never in my life felt so completely alone. And the hardest night of all, the first night truly by myself, with no couch to sleep on and no one left to call, was still ahead of me. Tyler's roommates, understandably, weren't comfortable with me staying on the couch indefinitely once Tyler and I had broken things off, and I didn't blame them for it. So on the third night after my parents put me out, I found myself sitting in the community college library, the same library where I'd found out I was pregnant 2 months earlier, because it was warm and open until 10, and I had nowhere else to be. I remember watching the librarian start turning off lights section by section as closing time approached, a signal I understood without needing to be told. You need to figure out where you're going, and you need to figure it out now. I ended up that first truly alone night in my car, an old Honda Civic my grandmother had left me 2 years before she passed, the one possession from my old life that was unambiguously mine, that no one could take back. I parked in the lot behind a 24-hour laundromat because it felt safer than an empty street, and I reclined the driver's seat as far as it would go, and I lay there in the dark with my hands folded over my stomach, talking quietly to a baby who couldn't understand a word I was saying yet, because I needed to talk to someone, and she was the only one left. I told her I was sorry. I told her this wasn't how it was supposed to start, that she deserved a nursery and 2 parents and grandparents who'd fight over who got to hold her first, and that I didn't know yet how I was going to give her any of that, but that I was going to try harder than I had ever tried at anything in my life. I remember crying so hard at one point that I had to stop talking, had to just breathe, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way my track coach used to tell us to breathe when a race started to hurt. I didn't sleep, not really. I drifted in and out, jolted awake by every sound in the parking lot, a car door, a raccoon knocking over a trash can, my own heartbeat, too loud in the silence. At some point around 4 in the morning, I allowed myself, for the first time since that Tuesday, to fully consider how bad this actually was. 19 years old. No home. No job that paid enough to change that. No family. $61, minus the gas I'd need to keep the car running so I could keep the heat on at night. I thought about calling Sophia. I almost did 3 or 4 times, my thumb hovering over her contact photo, the 2 of us at junior prom, arms around each other, both of us laughing at something neither of us could remember years later. I didn't call. I told myself it was because it was the middle of the night, but the truth was more complicated than that. I was ashamed. Even Sophia, who I trusted more than almost anyone, felt like someone I had to protect from the full weight of how far I'd fallen, and some old, stubborn part of me, the part my parents had built. The part that needed to be the girl who never gave anyone a gray hair, wasn't ready yet to let anyone see me like this. I watched the sun come up through the windshield sometime after 6, streaking pink and gray over the laundromat's flat roof, and I remember thinking, with a kind of exhausted, watery clarity, I have to figure this out. Not someday. Today. Because whatever happened to me from this point forward, there was a person depending on me now who had no say in any of it, and I was the only thing standing between her and the world. That morning, still stiff and sore from a night folded into a car seat, I made a decision that would end up shaping the rest of my life, though I couldn't have known it then. I was keeping this baby, no matter what it cost me. I want to talk honestly about this part of the story, because I think it's the part people are often most curious about and most quick to judge, in one direction or the other. In the days after that first night in the car, I sat with the decision in front of me with a clarity I hadn't expected. I thought about adoption genuinely, seriously, not as an idea my mother had shoved across a coffee table at me, but as something I turned over on my own terms, in the quiet of my car at the library. Walking the aisles of a grocery store I couldn't afford much from. I thought about what it would mean to give this baby to a family with 2 parents, a nursery already painted, grandparents who wouldn't blink at the idea of loving her. I thought about how much easier my own life would be 19, unencumbered, free to go back to school, free to try to patch things up with my parents on their terms. And every single time I thought it through, I came back to the same, simple, unshakable feeling. She was mine. Not in some abstract, sentimental way, in the most literal sense there is. I had felt her first flutter of movement 2 weeks earlier, a small underwater tap against my ribs while I sat alone in a library corral, and something in me had gone fiercely, permanently protective in that instant. Before I even knew if she was a boy or a girl, before I had a name for her, before I had any idea how I was going to keep either of us fed. I made an appointment at a free clinic on the other side of town. The kind of place with fluorescent lighting and hand-me-down waiting room chairs and a nurse practitioner named Carol who would end up being one of the first genuinely kind adults I encountered in this whole ordeal. She didn't ask me why I was alone. She didn't ask where my mother was. She just handed me a stack of pamphlets on prenatal nutrition and said, gently, let's take care of you and this baby, one appointment at a time. I cried in the parking lot afterward, not from sadness, for once, but from the sheer relief of being treated like a person instead of a problem to be managed. It was at that same clinic, a few weeks later, that I learned I was having a girl. I sat in the ultrasound room by myself, no partner's hand to squeeze, and watched a small flickering shape on the screen that the technician told me was a healthy heartbeat, strong and steady. And something in my chest cracked open with a love so immediate and so total that it frightened me a little. I decided, right there in that room, that I would name her Grace, not for any religious reason, though my mother would have appreciated that irony, but because Grace was the one thing nobody in my life seemed willing to extend to me right then. And I wanted my daughter's name to be a promise instead of a lack. I decided I would give her, every single day of her life, the grace that had been withheld from me. I know some people, hearing this story, will wonder whether I was being reckless, 19, homeless, keeping a baby with no plan for how to support her. I understand that question. I asked it of myself constantly in those months. But I want to say this clearly, for anyone listening who has been in a similar position and been told they were making the wrong choice, choosing to keep a child you already love is not recklessness. It's the first act of a kind of love that asks everything of you and gives you nothing back except the certainty that you did right by someone who couldn't yet ask you to. I didn't know, that spring, how I was going to survive the next 7 months. I only knew that I was going to try, with everything I had, and that whatever came next, Grace was never, ever going to wonder if she was wanted. The months that followed were the hardest sustained stretch of my life, and I say that with the full weight of everything that came before and after it. I found a room to rent above a garage on the edge of town, owned by an elderly widow named Mrs. Callahan who didn't ask too many questions and accepted $200 a month, which was more than I could reliably afford, but less than anywhere else I found. The room had a hot plate, a mini fridge, and a mattress on the floor, and I remember the specific, particular cold of that space in the early mornings before the sun warmed the tin roof enough to take the chill off. I dropped out of my classes at the community college. There was no way to afford tuition and rent and food all at once, not with the part-time hours I could manage while increasingly pregnant and increasingly exhausted. I took a job waiting tables at a diner on the outskirts of Cedar Falls called the Wagon Wheel, working doubles whenever they'd let me, standing on swollen feet for 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours at a stretch, coming home smelling like fryer grease and stale coffee. Too tired most nights to do anything but collapse onto that mattress on the floor. Money was a constant, grinding fear. I remember doing math in my head while I refilled ketchup bottles, rent due in 9 days, prenatal vitamins another $18, gas in the car another $20, over and over, a kind of anxious arithmetic that never fully stopped, even in my sleep. There were nights I ate nothing but a piece of toast because I was saving the rest of what I had for things Grace needed more than I needed dinner. I remember standing in the free clinic one afternoon in my 6th month, weighing in at a number lower than the nurse expected, and Carol looking at me with real worry in her eyes and asking, gently, if I was eating enough. I lied and said yes. I want to be honest about the loneliness of that time, too, because it was, in some ways, harder than the hunger or the exhaustion. I hadn't yet told Sophia the full truth. She knew I'd had a falling out with my parents, but I hadn't told her I was pregnant, hadn't told her I was living above a stranger's garage, hadn't let her see how far things had actually fallen, because some part of me was still too ashamed. I went to my prenatal appointments alone. I ate dinner alone. I lay awake at night with my hands on my belly, feeling Grace shift and kick, the only company I had, and I talked to her the way I had that first night in the car, promising her over and over that I was going to figure this out. That things were going to get better, even on nights when I wasn't sure I believed it myself. There was one night in my 7th month that I count as close to the lowest point of the entire ordeal. My car wouldn't start after a double shift, and I didn't have the money for a tow or a mechanic, and I ended up walking the 2.5 miles back to Mrs. Callahan's garage apartment in the dark, 7 months pregnant. Feet already aching from 10 hours on them, crying the whole way, not dramatically, just quietly, steadily, the way you cry when you're too tired to do anything bigger than that. I remember passing my parents' street on that walk, close enough to see the porch light glowing at the house on Maple Court, close enough to imagine, for 1 week, exhausted moment, just walking up and knocking and seeing if anything had changed. I didn't. I kept walking. Not out of pride, exactly. I don't think I had much pride left by that point, but because some instinct in me understood that if I went back now on these terms, exhausted and defeated, I would be walking back into the same conditions that had put me on that porch in the rain in the first place. I needed, somehow, to make it on my own first, even just a little, before I ever let myself go back. I made it home that night, soaked with sweat despite the cold, and I lay down on the mattress and put both hands on my belly and felt Grace kick, strong and insistent, like she was telling me to keep going. I decided that night that whatever it took, I was going to build something Grace, and I could actually stand on. I just didn't know yet how close I was to the hardest and most important night of the whole journey, the night she was actually born. Grace came 3 days before her due date, on a Thursday night in early November, almost exactly 1 year after I'd sat in that gas station parking lot calling Tyler for a ride in the rain. I was folding laundry in my little room above Mrs. Callahan's garage when the first contraction hit, a tightening low in my back that I mistook, at first, for the same false labor pains I'd been having on and off for 2 weeks. It wasn't until the second one came, 20 minutes later, sharper, that I let myself believe this was real. I didn't have anyone to call to drive me to the hospital. I want to sit with that fact for a moment, because I think it's one of the details of this story that still, 10 years later, catches in my throat. Most women, on the night they go into labor, have someone beside them, a partner, a mother, a sister, someone gripping their hand in the passenger seat while they breathe through the pain. I drove myself. I sat at red lights breathing through contractions with both hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, and I remember thinking, with a strange, adrenaline-sharpened clarity, that I had gotten myself this far entirely alone. And I was going to get myself through this too. Mrs. Callahan, bless her, heard me start the car at 11 at night and came down in her robe to ask if I was all right. When I told her I thought I was in labor, she insisted on riding with me, sitting in the passenger seat of my old Civic in her nightgown and slippers, holding my hand every time a contraction came, telling me about the births of her own 3 children 50 years earlier in a steady, soothing voice that I will be grateful for as long as I live. She wasn't my mother. She wasn't even really my friend, not yet, not at that point, just a kind, elderly widow who happened to be home when I needed someone. But she was there, and in the absence of anyone who was supposed to be there, that mattered more than I can properly describe. Labor lasted 14 hours. I won't pretend it wasn't the hardest physical thing I have ever done, because it was hour after hour of pain that seemed to have no end. A nurse named Denise who held my hand through the worst of the pushing when Mrs. Callahan needed a coffee break. A moment somewhere around hour 11 when I remembered genuinely wondering if I had the strength left to finish what I'd started. And then, at 6:47 in the morning, they set her on my chest, still slick and warm and impossibly small, and she opened her eyes for just a second and looked, or seemed to look, directly at me. And I felt something happen in my chest that I have never had adequate words for since. All the exhaustion, all the fear, all the months of grinding poverty and loneliness, none of it disappeared, exactly, but all of it reorganized itself instantly around this one, undeniable fact. I would do every single bit of it again, without hesitation, for her. I named her Grace Elizabeth Sanders, Elizabeth for my grandmother, the one who left me the car that got me through the hardest year of my life. I held her for hours that first day, Mrs. Callahan sitting beside my hospital bed like the grandmother Grace didn't have yet, and I remember looking down at my daughter's face and making her a second promise. One I would repeat to myself on every hard day still to come. Whatever it costs me, you will never, ever doubt that you are wanted. Nobody from my family came to the hospital. I hadn't told them. I didn't know yet whether I ever would. But that morning, holding my daughter for the first time, I understood something with total certainty that I hadn't fully understood before. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I had someone to build a life for. And somewhere in that hospital room, without knowing it yet, the woman I would eventually become had just been born alongside my daughter. The weeks after Grace was born were a blur of a very specific kind of exhaustion, the kind that doesn't just make you tired, but makes you tired in a way that reshapes how you experience time itself. Days folded into nights folded into days again, marked only by feedings, by the particular cry that meant hunger versus the one that meant a wet diaper versus the one that meant she just wanted to be held, which, in those early weeks, felt like most of the time. Mrs. Callahan, without ever making a formal announcement of it, became something between a landlord and a grandmother in those first months. She'd knock on my door in the mornings with a cup of tea and ask to hold Grace, just for a minute, so I could shower, and those minutes turned into an hour, sometimes two, an old woman rocking a newborn on her porch swing, humming songs in a language I didn't recognize, while I slept in 10-minute increments upstairs. I don't know how I would have made it through those first 2 months without her, and I've thought often, in the years since, about how strange and important it is that the person who filled the grandmother-shaped hole in Grace's early life wasn't blood at all. Just a woman who happened to be kind when kindness was the only thing standing between us and total collapse. I went back to work at the wagon wheel 6 weeks after Grace was born, because 6 weeks was as long as I could afford to go without a paycheck. I remember the specific grief of that first morning, handing my 6-week-old daughter over to Mrs. Callahan and driving to my shift with tears streaming down my face the entire way, not because I didn't trust her, but because some part of me hadn't imagined, even during the hardest parts of pregnancy, how physically painful it would be to be separated from her. The diner became my whole world in a way it hadn't been before. I picked up every double shift they'd give me, working breakfast and lunch back to back, 6 days a week, coming home with feet so swollen I had to soak them in a basin before I could even hold my daughter properly. My tips were decent on good days. The wagon wheel sat on a state highway that pulled in truckers and travelers who tended to tip well when the coffee was hot and the pie was good, but decent tips and a diner wage still weren't enough to build any kind of real cushion. I was living paycheck to paycheck in the truest sense, some weeks choosing between diapers and my own groceries, always choosing diapers. I want to talk about something people don't discuss enough about that period of my life, which is the specific, quiet cruelty of small-town judgment. Cedar Falls was not a large enough place for my situation to stay private for long. I'd hear the whispers sometimes when I brought Grace into the grocery store in her stroller, women my mother's age, some of them from our old church, murmuring to each other just loud enough for me to catch fragments. "That's the Sanders girl. Such a shame. You'd think her parents would help." I learned to keep my chin up and my eyes forward in those moments, though it cost me something every single time, a small tax on my dignity that I paid over and over throughout that first year. Sophia found out, finally, about 4 months after Grace was born, not from me directly, but because Cedar Falls is small and word travels, and she showed up at Mrs. Callahan's garage apartment one Sunday afternoon, furious, not at me, but on my behalf, that I'd been carrying all of this alone without telling her. She held Grace for the first time that afternoon and cried, and made me promise, in a voice that left no room for argument, that I would never again try to carry something like this by myself without telling her. Sophia became, from that day forward, one of the steadiest people in my life, and I have never stopped being grateful that she refused to let my shame keep her out. But even with Sophia back in my life, even with Mrs. Callahan's help, those months were a genuine test of everything I had. I was 19, then 20, Raising a daughter alone on a diner waitress's income, working my body past the point of reasonable exhaustion, and, some nights, rocking Grace back to sleep at 3 in the morning after a double shift. I would look at her small sleeping face and wonder, honestly wonder, whether I had it in me to keep doing this for 18 more years. I always answered myself the same way. I looked at her, and I thought about the promise I'd made on that hospital bed, and I kept going. But I knew even then that survival wasn't going to be enough forever. I needed a plan. And the plan, when it finally started to take shape, began with the decision to work even harder than I already was. By the time Grace was 8 months old, I had come to a hard, clear-eyed conclusion, waiting tables at the wagon wheel, even working every double shift they'd give me, was never going to be enough to build the kind of life I wanted for my daughter. It kept us fed. It kept the lights on most months. But it left no room for anything beyond survival, and survival, I had started to realize, could not be the ceiling of my ambition for Grace's whole childhood. So I added a second job. Then, eventually, a third. My days, for the better part of the next 2 years, looked something like this. I woke at 5 in the morning to get Grace fed and dressed before dropping her at Mrs. Callahan's, who by then had essentially become her daytime caregiver, charging me far less than any daycare in town would have, insisting, whenever I tried to pay her more, that she liked the company. I worked the breakfast and lunch shift at the diner until 3. 3 evenings a week, I cleaned offices downtown for a commercial cleaning service, pushing a cart of supplies through empty hallways from 6 to 10 at night, vacuuming carpets and emptying trash cans in rooms lit only by the hallway light I'd propped the door open with. On weekends, I picked up shifts doing the books for a small hardware store owned by a friend of Mrs. Callahan's, a skill I'd half learned watching my father balance his checkbook by hand all those years, a strange, small inheritance from the man who'd put me out in the rain. I was exhausted in a way that went beyond tired, a bone-deep depletion that became the background condition of my entire life. I remember falling asleep standing up once, propped against a filing cabinet at the cleaning job, waking with a start after what felt like seconds, but had probably been closer to a full minute. I remember driving home from a closing shift at the diner one night so tired that I missed my own street and had to circle back, terrified, suddenly wide awake, at how easily I could have drifted into oncoming traffic. But I want to be honest about something else, too, because this isn't only a story about hardship, it's also a story about what those years built in me. I discovered, during that stretch, a kind of resilience I hadn't known I had, and more than that, I discovered I was good at the parts of work that had nothing to do with physical stamina. Doing the books for that hardware store, I found I had a real feel for numbers, for spotting where money was leaking out of a small business, for organizing chaos into something that made sense on a page. The owner, a gruff man named Walt who rarely complimented anyone, told me once, almost begrudgingly, that I had a head for this stuff. The first time in years anyone had told me I was good at something that had nothing to do with being someone's daughter or someone's mother. I started reading everything I could get my hands on about small business and bookkeeping in whatever scraps of time I had, during Grace's naps, on my lunch breaks, propped up in bed for 20 minutes before I fell asleep each night. I didn't have a plan yet, not a real one, not something I could have described out loud to anyone. But some quiet, stubborn part of me had started to believe that the numbers I was learning to read might be the thing that eventually pulled Grace and me out of the exhausting, unglamorous cycle of 3 jobs and never enough sleep. Grace, through all of it, was thriving in the ways that mattered most, even if I sometimes felt guilty about how little of her early milestones I was there to witness in real time. She took her first steps in Mrs. Callahan's kitchen while I was scrubbing an office bathroom 4 miles away, and Mrs. Callahan filmed it on an old flip phone so I could watch it, over and over, the moment I got home. She said her first word up, reaching for me the second I walked in the door each evening, and I remember thinking that, even exhausted, even broke, even entirely alone in raising her, I had never in my life felt as certain of anything as I felt of my love for that little girl. It was around this time, when Grace was almost 2, working 3 jobs and running on fumes, that I met a woman who would end up changing the entire trajectory of my life, not with money, not with some grand gesture, but with a simple offer of kindness at exactly the moment I needed it most. Her name was Patricia Owens, and she came into the wagon wheel almost every Tuesday and Friday morning, always alone, always ordering the same thing, black coffee and dry wheat toast, and always sitting in my section by the window, whether by coincidence or, as I'd come to learn, by quiet design. Patricia was somewhere in her early 60s, sharp-eyed, soft-spoken, the kind of woman who noticed things other people missed. She noticed, over the course of several months, that I always looked exhausted. She noticed the small gold band-aid on my finger one week from a burn at the cleaning job, and the dark circles that never fully faded no matter how much concealer I used. She noticed, one Friday morning, that I'd absent-mindedly started doing quick mental math out loud, correcting a mistake on a coworker's register total before the coworker had even noticed it herself. And she watched me do it with an expression I couldn't quite read. She asked me to sit down with her for a few minutes during a lull between the breakfast and lunch rush, which the diner rarely allowed, but Patricia had a way of making requests that felt more like foregone conclusions. She told me she owned 3 restaurants across the state, nothing flashy, family-style places like the Wagon Wheel, but well-run and steadily profitable, and that she was in the process of expanding, opening a 4th location about 40 minutes outside Cedar Falls, and that she needed someone to help manage the books for it, at least part-time, while she trained someone more permanent. "I've watched you do math in your head faster than most people can do it on a calculator," she said. "And I've watched you handle every difficult customer in this place with more patience than they deserve. That's not nothing. That's a set of skills, whether or not anyone's told you that yet." I remember sitting across from her, 21 years old, exhausted down to my bones, and feeling something loosen in my chest that I hadn't let myself feel in nearly 2 years, the sensation of someone seeing not what I lacked, but what I actually had to offer. I told her, honestly, that I only had a year of community college, no formal bookkeeping training beyond what I'd taught myself out of library books and late nights. She waved that off. "I didn't ask about your degree," she said. "I asked if you could do the job. You already showed me you can." She offered me $15 an hour to start, working the books for her new location 15 hours a week, with the flexibility to build the hours around Grace's schedule, a wage and a flexibility that, combined, were more valuable to me than almost anything else I'd been offered in 2 years of scraping by. I took the job before she'd even finished laying out all the details, and I remember driving home that night, Grace asleep in her car seat behind me, crying tears that were, for the first time in a very long time, entirely happy ones. What started as 15 hours a week became 20, then 30, as Patricia saw what I could do, not just balancing books, but noticing patterns, catching wasteful ordering habits, suggesting small changes to supplier contracts that saved her real money. Within 8 months, she'd made me the full-time bookkeeper and, increasingly, an informal operations advisor for all 4 of her restaurants, a role that let me finally quit the cleaning job and cut back my diner shifts. And for the first time since Grace was born, I was working 1 real job instead of 3 exhausting ones. Patricia became something more than an employer to me over those months. She became, in a lot of ways, the mentor I hadn't known I needed, the kind of steady, unconditional support I'd once assumed only family could provide. She asked about Grace by name. She kept a small toy chest in the back office for the days I couldn't find childcare and had to bring her along. She never once made me feel like a charity case, but she also never let me forget that she believed in me, actively, vocally, in a way that started to rebuild something in me that 2 years of being disowned and abandoned had worn dangerously thin. The simple belief that I was worth investing in. It was Patricia, sitting across from me in her cramped little office one evening after closing, who first said the words that would end up reshaping the next several years of my life. "You know," she said, looking at the growth numbers I'd just shown her from the new location, "you have a real business mind, Emma. Have you ever thought about finishing your degree?" "Not for me. For you." I hadn't let myself think about it in almost 2 years. That night, driving home with Grace asleep in the back seat, I started to think about it seriously for the first time. It took me another 6 months after that conversation with Patricia to actually work up the courage to enroll again. 6 months of running the numbers over and over, trying to figure out how a 22-year-old single mother working 40 hours a week could possibly also take college classes without somewhere, breaking. What finally pushed me forward was a scholarship program I found almost by accident, scrolling through a community bulletin board at the library one evening while Grace napped in her stroller beside me. It was a state grant specifically for single parents returning to school, covering tuition and a portion of childcare costs for anyone willing to commit to a business or accounting-related degree program. I remember reading the eligibility requirements 3 times, half convinced there had to be a catch, before I let myself believe that this might actually be for someone like me. I applied with Patricia's help. She wrote me a recommendation letter that made me cry reading it, describing me, in her plain, understated way, as the most naturally capable young businessperson I have worked with in 30 years of running restaurants. A sentence I kept a printed copy of in my nightstand drawer for years afterward, pulling it out on hard days like a talisman. I got the scholarship. I enrolled in night and weekend business administration classes at the same community college I dropped out of 3 years earlier, walking back onto that campus for the first time since the semester I'd found out I was pregnant, feeling a strange, vertiginous mixture of shame and defiance, shame at how different my life looked from most of the 18-year-olds filling the hallways, defiance at the fact that I was there at all, that I hadn't let anything that happened to me be the final word on what I was capable of. Balancing school, work, and Grace was, without exaggeration, one of the hardest sustained stretches of effort I have ever put into anything. I did homework in the diner's back office during slow periods. I studied accounting principles at stoplights, flashcards propped against the steering wheel. I wrote papers after Grace went to sleep, sometimes not finishing until 2 or 3 in the morning, then getting up at 6 to start the whole cycle again. Mrs. Callahan, now well into her 70s, but as sharp and devoted as ever, watched Grace on the nights I had class, refusing payment more often than not, telling me, whenever I tried to insist, that watching Grace grow up was payment enough for a woman whose own children had long since moved across the country. There were nights I genuinely didn't think I could keep going. I remember one specific evening, about a year into my degree, sitting in my car outside the community college after a brutal statistics exam I was sure I'd failed, sobbing from sheer exhaustion, wondering whether any of this was actually going to add up to something or whether I was just running myself into the ground for nothing. I called Sophia that night, and she talked me through it the way she always did, steady, practical, refusing to let me spiral, reminding me of every single thing I'd already survived that had once felt equally impossible. I passed that statistics exam, as it turned out, with a grade higher than I'd dared to hope for. And slowly, semester by semester, working full-time and raising Grace and studying in every spare fragment of time I could scrape together, I built toward something I hadn't let myself want out loud in years, a real degree, a real credential, proof on paper of everything Patricia had already told me she saw in me. It took me nearly 4 years, working around Grace's schedule and my job, to finish what most people complete in 2, a business administration degree with a concentration in accounting, earned almost entirely at night, almost entirely exhausted, almost entirely while raising a daughter alone. Grace, by then 8, and then 9 years old, grew up alongside the business in a way that felt, to me, like exactly the childhood I'd wanted to give her, stable, secure, watching her mother build something real. She'd come by the office some Fridays after school, set up at the small table in the break room with her homework, and my employees adored her, several of them keeping snacks on hand just for her visits. And I remember the specific pride of watching my daughter feel entirely at home in a place I had built from nothing. I want to talk honestly about what success actually felt like during that period, because it wasn't the uncomplicated triumph people sometimes imagine from the outside. There was real joy in it, the joy of financial security, finally, truly, without the anxious mental math that had shadowed nearly every day of Grace's early childhood, the joy of hiring people and watching them grow into their roles. The joy of driving Grace to a genuinely excellent school in a genuinely safe neighborhood, in a car that didn't threaten to break down on the highway. But there was an undercurrent, too, a persistent ache that success didn't erase. The ache of having built all of this without the family who should have been there to see it. The strange loneliness of major milestones with no parents to call, and a complicated, hard-to-name grief that even now, with everything going right, some part of me still wanted my mother and father to be proud of me, even after everything they'd done. I threw myself into the business partly, I think, because it was easier than sitting with that ache directly. Cedar and Sage expanded into a second state, then a third, eventually growing to serve restaurant groups across the region, and I hired a genuinely talented operations director, Marcus, the same Marcus who'd made that first pivotal phone call, who eventually left his corporate role to join me full-time as a partner, believing in what we were building enough to bet his own career on it. By the time Grace turned 9, Cedar and Sage had grown into a business generating enough revenue that I was able to do something I'd promised myself in the hardest years, back when I was choosing between diapers and my own dinner. I started a small scholarship fund, quietly, through the local community college, specifically for single parents returning to school, the same kind of grant that had once made my own degree possible. I funded it anonymously at first, not wanting the story attached to my name, wanting it simply to help the way that scholarship had once helped me. Life, by any outward measure, had become everything I once thought was impossible for someone in my position. A thriving business. A beautiful, happy, thriving daughter. Real financial security. Real friends, real community, real stability. And yet, as Grace's 10th birthday approached, 10 years, almost exactly, since that October night on the porch, I found myself thinking more and more about my parents, wondering, in idle moments I couldn't quite explain, what they were doing now. Whether they ever thought about me, whether any part of them had softened in a decade of silence. I had no idea that the answer to that question was about to arrive at my own front door. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to spend some time on the person who mattered more than any business success in this entire story, my daughter, Grace, who by the time she turned 10 had grown into someone I am prouder of than anything else I have ever built. Grace was, from very early on, a fiercely curious kid, the kind who asked why so many times in a row that even patient adults eventually ran out of answers. She loved science in a way that surprised me, given that neither Tyler nor I had ever shown much aptitude for it. By second grade, she was checking out library books about the solar system and correcting my pronunciation of Neptune. And by fourth grade, she'd built, with help from one particularly dedicated teacher, a genuinely impressive volcano model for the school science fair that took second place in the district, an achievement she was more proud of than almost anything else in her young life at that point. I made a deliberate choice, from the time she was old enough to understand any of it, to be honest with her about our story, not all at once, not in a way that burdened a small child with adult grief, but in age-appropriate pieces as she grew. By 6, she knew that her grandparents lived in the same town, but that we didn't see them, and that this made me sad sometimes. By 9, she knew more of the real shape of it, that they had asked me to choose between keeping her and staying in their home, and that I had chosen her, without hesitation, and that I would make the exact same choice again every single time. I remember the day I told her that particular piece of the story most clearly, because of how she responded. She was quiet for a long moment, processing it in the careful, serious way she processed most things, and then she said, "So you picked me even though it made your life so much harder?" And when I told her yes, without any hesitation at all, she wrapped her arms around my waist and said, "I'm really glad you picked me," and I remember standing in our kitchen holding my daughter, crying the good kind of tears, thinking that whatever else I had or hadn't accomplished in my life, I had gotten this one thing unmistakably right. Grace grew up kind in a way I don't think I can fully take credit for. It was simply who she was, from very early on. The kid who invited the left-out classmate to sit with her at lunch, who saved her allowance to buy a birthday present for a friend whose family couldn't afford much, who once, at 8 years old, gave her own winter coat to a classmate who didn't have one warm enough, coming home in just a sweater and explaining, with total simplicity, "She needed it more than me, Mom." I remember standing in our kitchen that evening, half wanting to scold her for giving away an expensive coat without asking, and mostly just overwhelmed with pride at the kind of person she was becoming. She was funny, too, in a dry, understated way that reminded me sometimes, with a small ache, of Tyler's laugh all those years ago, a resemblance I noticed more as she got older, though Tyler himself had remained almost entirely absent from her life. Sending a card on her birthday some years and not others, a peripheral, complicated presence that Grace, with remarkable maturity for her age, seemed to have made peace with far more completely than I had. By the time Grace turned 10, she was thriving, top of her class, close with a tight-knit group of friends, deeply loved by Sophia, who'd become an honorary aunt in every sense that mattered, and by Mrs. Callahan. Well into her 80s by then, but still sharp enough to beat Grace at checkers more often than not. She had, in short, exactly the childhood I had promised her on that hospital bed a decade earlier, safe, secure, and utterly certain, every single day of her life, that she was wanted. It was in the week leading up to her 10th birthday party, a party we'd planned for that Saturday, balloons already bought, a cake already ordered from the bakery Grace loved, that the doorbell rang on an ordinary Tuesday evening. And I opened it to find two people standing on my porch that I had not seen in exactly 10 years. I want to take a moment here to describe, fully, who I had become by the time that doorbell rang, because I think it matters for understanding what happened next. I was 29 years old. Cedar and Sage Consulting had grown into a company with 26 employees across 2 office locations, serving restaurant and food service clients across 4 states, generating annual revenue that would have been genuinely unimaginable to the exhausted 22-year-old doing books by hand in Patricia's cramped back office. I owned my home outright by then, a comfortable 4-bedroom house on a quiet street, purchased 3 years earlier with a down payment I'd saved entirely myself. The first time in my life I had ever owned anything with that much permanence attached to it. I drove a reliable car. I took Grace on a real vacation every summer, nothing extravagant, but real, memory-making trips, a week at the beach, a national park, a city she'd been wanting to see. I had, by any reasonable measure, built exactly the stable, secure life I had once stood on a rain-soaked porch and desperately hoped might someday exist for me and my daughter, though at the time, hope had felt like the wrong word for something that had seemed so thoroughly impossible. I want to be honest that success hadn't erased everything. I still, on quiet nights, thought about my parents more than I let most people know, not with the raw, desperate longing of those early years, but with a persistent, low-grade ache. The particular grief of an estrangement that never resolves into either full reconciliation or full closure, just an open wound that scars over without ever fully healing. I had heard, through the small-town grapevine that Sophia still maintained connections to, occasional fragments of news over the years, that my father had had some kind of health scare a few years back, that my mother had retired from teaching, that the house on Maple Court was still theirs, still standing, still holding whatever version of a life they'd built in my absence. I had thought, more than once over the years, about reaching out myself. I had drafted messages I never sent, sat with my phone in my hand more times than I could count, imagining a version of the conversation where I called and said, simply, "I have a daughter you've never met, and she is remarkable, and I wanted you to know that." I never sent any of them. Some part of me, even after everything I'd built, was still protecting the same fragile place that had cracked open on that porch a decade earlier, still afraid, on some level, of a second rejection that I wasn't sure I could survive as cleanly as I'd survived the first. Grace, meanwhile, had grown into a remarkably self-possessed 10-year-old who understood, with more clarity than a lot of adults manage, the shape of the wound her mother carried. She'd asked me, a few months before her 10th birthday, whether I ever wanted to see my parents again, and I remember sitting with her on the back porch of our home, the two of us watching the sun go down, and telling her honestly that I didn't know. That some days I wanted nothing to do with them ever again, and other days I found myself wondering what it would be like if they got to know her, got to see who she'd become, got to understand, even just a little, what they'd walked away from. "I think you should let them meet me," Grace had said, with the startling, uncomplicated wisdom kids sometimes have. "Not for them. For you. I think you're still kind of waiting for something, Mom, even though you won't say it." I hadn't had an answer for her that evening. I still didn't have one entirely, the week of her 10th birthday, as I finalized party plans and went about the ordinary business of my life, a life I had built entirely without my parents' help, entirely in spite of everything they had done, a life that I was, on balance, deeply proud of. I had no idea, that Tuesday morning, that I would come home from work that evening to find my answer standing on my porch, in the form of the two people I least expected and most, in some complicated, unresolved corner of my heart, still hoped to see. The doorbell rang at just past 7 in the evening. Grace was doing homework at the kitchen table, and I remember calling out, half distracted, "I've got it, sweetheart," as I walked toward the door, wiping my hands on a dish towel, expecting a delivery or a neighbor. I opened the door and, for a moment, genuinely did not process what I was seeing. My mother stood on my porch, 10 years older than the last time I'd seen her, her hair fully gray now where it had once been dyed a careful, controlled brown, her face thinner, more lined, though her eyes were the same eyes I remembered from that October night. Except that where those eyes had once held cold, controlled fury, they now held something I had never once seen in my mother in 19 years of living under her roof: fear. My father stood slightly behind her, and the change in him was, if anything, more startling. He had always been a solid, sturdy man, careful and precise in his movements, but the man on my porch looked smaller somehow, his shoulders rounded forward, a cane in one hand that I didn't remember him needing, his face pale in a way that made my chest tighten with an instinctive worry I hadn't expected to still feel for him. Nobody spoke for what felt like a very long time. I stood in my own doorway, 29 years old, in the home I had built entirely without them, looking at the two people who had put me out in the rain a decade earlier, and I felt a genuinely dizzying rush of competing emotions, old anger, surfacing instantly and completely intact, as if no time had passed at all, something that might have been pity, looking at how visibly diminished they both seemed, and underneath all of it, despite everything, a small, stubborn, humiliating flicker of the girl who used to get butterscotch candy for correct answers, who still, after everything, wanted her parents to see her and be proud. "Emma," my mother said finally, her voice cracking on the single syllable of my name in a way I had never once heard from her. "Please. We need to talk to you." I almost closed the door. I want to be honest about that. Some old, protective part of me came very close to simply shutting it, the way they had shut theirs on me. A decade of silence answered with a decade of silence in return. But Grace's voice came from behind me, curious, having heard voices at the door. "Mom? Who is it?" My mother's eyes moved past me, into the house, and landed on my daughter for the very first time in her life. This granddaughter she had never met, never held, never even seen a photograph of. Standing at 10 years old in our kitchen doorway with her homework pencil still in one hand. I watched my mother's face crumple in a way I had genuinely never seen before, a full, unguarded collapse of composure that the woman who raised me had never once allowed herself, not even at her own mother's funeral. "That's her," my mother whispered, more to my father than to me. "Richard, that's her." I stood there, my hand still on the door, watching my parents look at my daughter for the first time, and I understood, with a strange, dawning clarity, that whatever had brought them here after 10 years of silence, it wasn't a casual visit. Something had happened. Something serious enough to bring two proud, stubborn people to the doorstep of the daughter they'd disowned, to finally, after a decade, need something from her that pride alone could no longer keep them from asking for. "What's going on?" I said, and I heard my own voice come out steadier than I felt. My father spoke for the first time, his voice thinner than I remembered, worn down by whatever had happened to him in the years since I'd last heard it. Emma, I'm sick, he said. I have been for a while now. And your mother, he stopped, glanced at her, and something passed between them that looked, for the first time in my memory, less like a united front and more like two frightened, aging people who had run out of other options. We don't have anyone else to ask, my mother said quietly. We need your help, Emma. I know we have no right to ask for it, but we don't have anyone else. I invited them in. I want to be honest that it wasn't an easy decision, and it wasn't a purely generous one either. Some part of me needed to understand what had actually happened. Needed to hear the full shape of whatever crisis had driven them to my door after 10 years of nothing, before I could decide what, if anything, I owed them. Grace watched with wide, curious eyes as I led two strangers into our living room, and I made a quick, quiet decision. The kind of decision you make in seconds that ends up mattering enormously, to introduce them honestly. Grace, I said, this is your grandmother, Diane, and your grandfather, Richard. I watched my daughter's face process the information, watched her look between the two aging strangers in her living room and the mother she'd only ever heard describe them in fragments, and I watched her do something that still, remembering it, makes my chest tight with pride. She walked forward, extended her hand like the well-raised, self-possessed kid she was, and said, "It's nice to finally meet you." My mother took my daughter's small hand in both of hers and began, quietly, to cry. I sent Grace to finish her homework in her room, gently but firmly, wanting to hear the actual situation before deciding how much of it she needed to be part of, and once she'd gone, my parents told me everything, taking turns, filling in gaps for each other in a way that suggested they'd rehearsed this conversation many times in the car on the way over, trying to figure out how to ask for something they'd once told me, in almost identical words, that I wasn't entitled to receive from them. My father had been diagnosed with a serious heart condition nearly 2 years earlier, a condition requiring an expensive, ongoing course of treatment, plus, eventually, a surgery their insurance covered only partially. He had also, in the last year, developed early-stage kidney problems, compounding everything, requiring dialysis 3 times a week that had made it impossible for him to continue working even the reduced hours he'd been managing. My mother, having retired from teaching 4 years earlier on a modest pension, had exhausted their savings on medical bills, then remortgaged the house on Maple Court, then exhausted that money too, and was now facing the genuine possibility of losing the house entirely if they couldn't find a way to cover my father's ongoing treatment costs. We tried everything else first, my mother said, and I understood, hearing the specific shame in her voice, that this admission cost her something significant. We asked my sister. We took out every loan the bank would give us. We are not here because we thought of you first, Emma. We are here because we ran out of everyone and everything else, and someone at church mentioned they'd heard you'd built a successful business, and she stopped, pressed a hand to her mouth, and for a long moment didn't continue. I didn't want to come, she said finally, quietly, more honest than I had ever heard her be in my entire childhood. Not because I don't, she stopped again. I was ashamed, Emma. Coming here meant admitting what we did to you. It meant admitting we were wrong, and I have spent 10 years telling myself we weren't. I sat across from my parents in my own living room, the home I'd built entirely without them, funded entirely by the success they'd told me, a decade earlier, that I'd be too disgraced to ever achieve. And I felt something complicated and enormous move through me. Not simple forgiveness. Not simple anger, either, though plenty of that old anger was still there, fully intact, 10 years unweathered. Something more complicated, the strange, vertiginous experience of watching two people who once held total power over your life sit in front of you, powerless, needing something only you could give them. I need to think, I told them. It was the only honest thing I could say. I need some time. This isn't a small thing you're asking. My mother nodded, chastened in a way I had genuinely never seen from her, and my father, struggling slightly, rose from the couch using his cane, and as they moved toward the door, my mother turned back, glancing once toward the hallway where Grace's bedroom door stood slightly ajar. "She's beautiful, Emma," she said quietly. "She's absolutely beautiful. I'm so sorry we missed all these years." I closed the door behind them that night, and I stood in my own front hallway for a long time, hand still on the doorknob, feeling the full, disorienting weight of 10 years of unresolved history finally, unavoidably, arriving at my door. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat at my kitchen table long after Grace had gone to bed, running through a decade of memories, the porch, the rain, the deadbolt, the folder of adoption pamphlets slid across a coffee table, every hard year that had followed, and trying to weigh all of it against the image of my father's thin, worn face, my mother's cracked voice, the genuine, unguarded fear I had seen in both of them for the first time in my life. I called Sophia before I called anyone else, and she listened to the whole thing without interrupting, the way she always did, and when I finished, she asked me the one question that cut through everything. What do you actually want to do, Emma? Not what you think you should do. What do you want? I didn't have an answer that night. But 3 days later, after turning it over from every angle I could think of, I called my mother and asked them to come back, not for a decision yet, but for a real conversation, the one we should have had 10 years earlier and never did. They came back on a Saturday afternoon, and this time, I asked Grace if she wanted to be part of it, and she said yes, with the same clear-eyed steadiness she brought to most things, and so the four of us sat together in my living room. 3 generations of a fractured family finally, actually talking, instead of performing politeness or silence at each other the way we had for a decade. I told them everything, in a way I never had the chance to before. I told them about the gas station payphone, about Tyler's car pulling away, about the first night in my Civic behind the laundromat. I told them about walking 2.5 miles home pregnant in the dark because my car wouldn't start. I told them about giving birth with Mrs. Callahan, a stranger, holding my hand instead of either of them. I told them about 3 jobs, about falling asleep against a filing cabinet, about the specific, grinding fear of choosing between diapers and dinner. I watched my mother cry through most of it, silent tears she made no attempt to wipe away, and I watched my father's jaw tighten and release, an old man absorbing, for the first time, the full weight of what his ultimatum had actually cost. We thought we were protecting the family, my father said finally, his voice rough. I told myself for years that we did the right thing by our principles. I didn't let myself think about what it actually meant for you, alone at 19. I didn't let myself think about it because I couldn't stand what I'd see if I did. You didn't protect anything, I said, and I felt the old anger rise up clean and clear, undiminished by 10 years or by their obvious suffering now. You protected your reputation at church. You protected what the neighbors would think. You didn't protect me. You threw me out in the rain with $63 and let me figure out how to keep a baby alive completely alone. My mother, through her tears, said something I hadn't expected, an admission that seemed to cost her more than anything else that afternoon. I used to lie awake, she said, wondering if you were safe, wondering if you had enough to eat. I told myself you'd come back when you realized how hard it was, that you'd give up the baby and come home, and we could pretend none of it happened. When you didn't come back, I told myself you must be fine, because the alternative, that you weren't fine, that you were suffering because of a choice we made, was more than I could carry. It was easier to believe you were fine than to face what we'd done. Grace, who had been quiet through most of this, sitting close beside me on the couch, spoke up then, in the clear, direct way she'd always had even as a small child. My mom wasn't fine, she said. She worked 3 jobs. She missed my first steps because she was cleaning an office building. She cried sometimes when she thought I was asleep in the first house we lived in, and I used to hear her through the wall. I felt my own eyes fill, hearing that, a detail of my daughter's early childhood I hadn't known she carried, a small 10-year-old who had absorbed more of my exhaustion and grief than I ever wanted her to. My mother made a sound then that I had never once heard from her in 19 years of living in her house, something between a sob and a moan, an entirely undone sound, and she said, "I am so sorry, Emma. I am so sorry. There is no version of an apology big enough for what we did to you, and I understand if that's not enough, if it can never be enough. But I need you to know that not one day has gone by in 10 years that I haven't carried what we did." I sat with that for a long moment, my daughter's hand finding mine on the couch cushion between us, and I understood that we had finally, after a decade, arrived at the real conversation, the one where the truth, all of it, on every side, was finally out in the open. It was during that same long Saturday afternoon conversation that a detail emerged that I hadn't known, one that reframed something I had believed for 10 years without ever fully questioning it. I had always believed, in the years since I'd been put out, that my parents had simply never tried to find me, that their silence had been total, deliberate, and unbroken, a decade-long confirmation of the words my mother said on the porch that night. It turned out that wasn't entirely true. My father, haltingly, told me that about 4 years after I left, my mother had actually driven out to the Wagon Wheel, the diner where I'd worked those brutal early years, hoping to see me, or at least ask about me. By the time she got there, I had already moved on to working with Patricia full-time, and the manager on duty, a woman who didn't know the history, told my mother only that I no longer worked there and that she didn't have any forwarding information. I sat in my car in that parking lot for almost an hour, my mother said, trying to decide whether to keep looking for you, whether to ask around town, whether to try to find you through Sophia's family. And in the end, I convinced myself that if you'd wanted us to know where you were, you would have told us. I told myself your silence was an answer. I didn't let myself consider that maybe you thought our silence, all those years earlier, had been the actual answer, that we'd made it clear you weren't welcome to come back, so why would you reach out first? I sat with that revelation for a long moment, feeling something shift slightly inside me, not absolving them, not erasing 10 years of very real suffering, but complicating the simple story I had told myself, the one where they never once looked back. It didn't undo what they'd done. But it meant something to learn that somewhere in that decade of silence, at least once, my mother had gone looking. There was another truth that came out that afternoon, one that hit differently, harder in some ways. My father admitted, quietly, looking at his hands rather than at me, that a large part of his insistence on the ultimatum 10 years earlier hadn't only been about reputation, though that had been real too. It had also been about his own father, my grandfather, who I'd never known well, who had died when I was young, a man who had, by my father's account, been rigid and unforgiving in almost identical ways, and who had once, decades earlier, cut off his own younger sister for marrying a man the family disapproved of, a decision my father had grown up believing was simply how a family protected its standards. I did to you, my father said slowly, almost exactly what my father did to his sister. I told myself for years I was different from him, better than him, and then the first real test came, and I did the exact same thing, almost word for word. I've thought about that more than almost anything else these last 10 years. I didn't break a pattern. I just repeated it. I felt something in my chest loosen slightly, hearing that, not because it excused what he'd done, but because it helped me understand, more fully than I ever had, that the cruelty I'd experienced hadn't come from nothing. It had come from a chain of the same fear and rigidity passed down through generations, a chain that I now understood. With real clarity for the first time, I had broken completely the moment I chose Grace over their approval. The moment I decided that whatever happened to me, my own daughter would never inherit that particular kind of conditional love. I broke that pattern, I said quietly, more to myself than to them, the night I chose her. I looked at Grace, sitting beside me, and I felt, for the first time in this entire long, painful reunion, something that felt close to genuine peace. In the weeks that followed that first long conversation, I made a decision that surprised even me. I began, cautiously, allowing my parents back into a limited version of Grace's life, not because I had fully forgiven them. And not because I'd forgotten a single detail of what those first years had cost me, but because I watched my daughter's face the day she met her grandparents, and I understood that she deserved the chance to know them carefully, on my terms, at a pace I controlled. But real chance nonetheless. The first outing was small and deliberately low stakes. I allowed my mother to pick Grace up from school one Friday afternoon and take her for ice cream. A 2-hour window I spent the entire time nervously checking my phone. half expecting some old cruelty to resurface, some comment about Grace's clothes or her manners or her heritage that would confirm all my worst instincts about letting them close again. Instead, Grace came home glowing, full of stories about a grandmother who had asked her 100 questions about her science fair volcano and seemed to actually, genuinely want to know the answers. Over the following months, a real relationship began, tentatively, to take shape. My father, still weak from his ongoing treatment, took a particular delight in teaching Grace chess. The two of them hunched over a board at my kitchen table on Sunday afternoons, and I watched him light up in a way I hadn't seen since I was a little girl myself, quizzing me on state capitals for butterscotch candy on our old back porch. My mother, for her part, discovered that Grace shared her old love of baking, and the two of them spent hours in my kitchen some weekends. Flour dusted across the counters, my mother teaching Grace the same pie crust recipe she'd once taught me. Before everything fell apart. I want to be honest that watching this unfold wasn't uncomplicated for me. There were days I watched my parents' delight in my daughter and felt a sharp, unresolved grief for the version of childhood I might have had if they'd shown Grace this same warmth and curiosity when I was the one who needed it. There was a particular ache in watching my father patiently teach Grace chess, knowing that he had never once, in 19 years, sat with that same patience over anything I struggled with academically, always more focused on the outcome than the process. I never fully stopped feeling that ache, even as the relationship grew. I don't think grief like that fully resolves. I think you learn, instead, to let it exist alongside newer, better things, without asking it to disappear entirely. Grace, for her part, navigated the whole complicated situation with a maturity that continued to astonish me. She asked me questions sometimes, quiet and direct, about why I still seemed sad sometimes even as she was building this new relationship with her grandparents, and I answered her honestly, in age-appropriate ways, telling her that it was possible to be genuinely glad she was getting to know them while also still carrying real hurt about what they'd done to me, that both things could be true at once. That grown-up relationships were rarely as simple as fully forgiven or fully unforgiven. I think, Grace said to me once, with the startling clarity she sometimes produced out of nowhere, that you're letting me have grandparents even though it's hard for you. I think that's really brave, Mom. I remember holding on to that sentence for a long time afterward, because it captured something true that I hadn't fully articulated even to myself, that this wasn't really about my own reconciliation with my parents at all, not primarily. It was about giving my daughter something I'd decided, at 19, that she deserved, family, in whatever complicated, imperfect form it was available to give her, on my terms, at my pace, but available nonetheless. By Grace's 11th birthday, less than a year after that first doorbell rang, my parents had become a real, if carefully bounded, part of her life, present at birthdays and school events, welcome at my kitchen table on Sunday afternoons, but never again with unrestricted access to override my decisions, never again with the power to make me feel that my choices as a mother required their approval. I had built something new with them, something that bore almost no resemblance to the family I grew up in, one where I, finally, unambiguously, held the power in the relationship. But there remained one question I still hadn't answered, one that grew more urgent as my father's health continued to decline, whether I was actually going to help pay for his medical treatment, and if so, on what terms. I want to be honest about how long it took me to decide about the money, because I think the easy version of this story would have me forgiving everything instantly and writing a check the moment I saw my father's cane. That isn't what happened, and I don't think it should have been. I sat with the decision for nearly 2 months, running numbers the way I'd been trained to for years, but also running something harder to quantify, what I actually owed people who had, by any fair account, owed me infinitely more than I owed them. I talked it through extensively with Sophia, with Marcus, my business partner, who offered the useful, unsentimental perspective of someone outside the emotional wreckage of it all. I talked, too, with a therapist I had started seeing that year, at Sophia's gentle insistence, someone who helped me understand that forgiveness and financial support were not actually the same decision, that I could choose one without automatically owing the other. What I ultimately decided was this: I would help pay for my father's ongoing treatment, but not unconditionally, and not as an erasure of what had happened. I set up the arrangement through a structured plan with my accountant rather than simply handing over money directly, covering the actual medical costs through direct payment to providers, ensuring the house on Maple Court would be safe from the mortgage they'd taken out against it, but doing it in a way that was clear-eyed, businesslike, boundaried, rather than an emotional, all-forgiving rescue. I remember sitting my parents down to explain the arrangement, watching my mother's face move through relief, then something more complicated as she understood the terms weren't unconditional forgiveness dressed up as generosity. "I need you to understand something," I told them. "I'm doing this because you're Grace's grandparents, and because no one, even people who hurt me terribly, deserves to lose their home over unpaid medical bills if I have the means to prevent it. But I need you to understand that this isn't the same as saying what you did was okay. It wasn't. I'm choosing to help despite that, not because I've decided it didn't matter." My mother nodded, crying quietly, and said something that stayed with me. "I don't expect you to say it's okay, Emma. I don't think I could believe you if you did. I just didn't expect you to help at all, honestly, and I don't think I deserve that you did." There was a specific moment, a few weeks into this arrangement, that I think of as the actual turning point of the forgiveness question, not a single dramatic scene, but a small, quiet one. My father, recovering from a procedure, was staying at my house for a week so I could help manage his medications, and I found him one evening sitting alone at my kitchen table, looking at a framed photo I kept on the wall of Grace's kindergarten graduation. He didn't hear me come in, and I watched him for a moment before he noticed me, watched an expression on his face that I recognized, with a jolt, as genuine grief, not for himself, not for his health, but grief for every single milestone of Grace's early life that he had entirely missed by choice, a decade of birthdays and graduations and small, ordinary Tuesday evenings that he could never get back. "I can't undo it," he said quietly when he realized I was standing there. "I know that. I'm not asking you to pretend I can. I just want you to know that I see it now, really see it, in a way I didn't let myself see it for 10 years. I didn't offer him easy absolution that evening. I'm not sure I fully offered it at any single moment in this story, and I want to be honest about that because I think the real answer to forgiveness or goodbye isn't actually a clean binary. It's something messier and more ongoing, a decision, renewed continually, to let people back into a limited, boundaried version of your life, to hold both the hurt and the possibility of repair at the same time, without ever pretending the hurt didn't happen or that repair fully erases it. What I chose, in the end, wasn't total forgiveness, and it wasn't total goodbye either. It was something in between, a careful, deliberate, ongoing relationship, rebuilt on entirely different terms than the one that broke, one where I finally, for the first time in my entire life, held the power to decide how close they were allowed to come. About 8 months after that first doorbell rang, something happened that I hadn't anticipated, one final piece of this story that reframed nearly everything that came before it. I had asked Sophia, over the years, to occasionally, gently, keep an ear out through the Cedar Falls grapevine for any word about Tyler, not because I wanted him back in my life in any romantic sense. That ship had sailed permanently and completely years earlier, but because Grace, now 11, had started asking more pointed questions about her father, questions I felt she deserved honest answers to as she got older. What I learned, through a conversation Sophia had almost by accident with someone from our old community college, was that Tyler had, in fact, tried to reach out several times over the years. A handful of calls to my old cell number in Grace's first 2 years of life, calls that had gone unanswered because I'd changed numbers twice in that chaotic early stretch, once when my phone was disconnected for non-payment during the leanest months, and again when I finally stabilized enough to get a new plan under my own name. There had, apparently, also been at least one letter sent to Mrs. Callahan's address the year Grace turned 2, that Mrs. Callahan, in the depths of her own grief after losing her husband's old dog, the last living connection to her late husband, and in the early stages of a mild cognitive decline that none of us recognized yet, had simply misplaced, tucked into a drawer where it sat, forgotten, until it was found, years later, by a home health aide helping her declutter, long after any chance to act on it had passed. I want to be careful in how I talk about this part, because it doesn't erase what actually happened. Tyler still made the choice, in that car outside my old dorm, to walk away, still chose his own comfort over showing up for a child he'd helped create. And no loss letter changes the fundamental truth that he had years, plenty of years, in which he could have tried harder, could have found another way to reach us, could have shown up at the diner, or the community college, or simply asked around. In a town small enough that finding someone was never truly impossible. But it added a layer of complexity I hadn't expected, the possibility that at least one early attempt at connection had been lost to ordinary human circumstance rather than deliberate abandonment, that the story wasn't quite as simple as I had told myself for over a decade. I sat with Grace, once I'd confirmed what I could of this information, and told her honestly what I'd learned, that her father had, apparently, tried at least once, early on, to reach out. That the attempt had been lost through circumstances nobody had controlled, but that in the years since, as far as I could tell, he had not tried particularly hard to find another way, had settled into a pattern of distant, occasional contact. A birthday card some years, silence in others, that fell well short of real, sustained effort. Grace, listening to all of this with her characteristic thoughtful quiet, eventually said something that struck me as remarkably wise for an 11-year-old. I think, she said, people can mess up in different ways. Grandma and Grandpa messed up on purpose, and it sounds like they know it now. My dad maybe didn't mess up on purpose that one time, but then he just kind of didn't keep trying. I don't think that makes it okay. But I don't think it's exactly the same kind of not okay either. I found myself, in the weeks after that conversation, reaching out to Tyler myself for the first time in over a decade, not to rekindle anything, and not, particularly, to forgive him in any full sense, but to give Grace the chance if she wanted it. To build whatever small, honest relationship with her biological father that was still possible, on terms I would set and monitor carefully. Tyler, when I finally reached him, was tearful, apologetic in a way that felt more genuine than I expected, and cautiously, slowly, over the following months, a limited, careful relationship began, occasional video calls. A single supervised visit, nothing close to the father Grace deserved, but something more honest than the silence that had defined most of her childhood. It wasn't the ending I had imagined for this particular thread of the story. But I've come to believe that the truest endings are rarely as clean as the ones we imagine in advance. This one, messy and partial and still evolving even now, felt more honest than any tidy resolution could have. I don't believe, looking back on everything that happened, in karma in any simple, cosmic sense, the idea that the universe balances the scales, punishing cruelty and rewarding virtue in some neat, observable ledger. I think, if anything, my story proves the opposite, that terrible things can happen to you through no fault of your own, that the people who hurt you may never face any consequence beyond their own eventual regret, and that whatever justice exists in a story like mine has to be built, deliberately, by the person who survived it, rather than delivered by some balancing force in the universe. What I do believe in, having lived through all of it, is this: the specific, quiet justice of simply refusing to let cruelty be the final word on your life. My parents were never formally punished for what they did to me. They faced no legal consequence, no public reckoning, nothing beyond the private, internal reckoning my father described that evening at my kitchen table, looking at a photograph of a granddaughter's kindergarten graduation he'd missed by choice. The closest thing to justice in this story isn't anything that happened to them. It's everything I built in spite of them, a thriving business, a genuinely happy childhood for my daughter, a life built on my own terms, entirely independent of their approval or their money. I think about Patricia often in this context, and about Mrs. Callahan, and about Sophia, and about Carol, the nurse practitioner at the free clinic who handed me pamphlets on prenatal nutrition instead of judgment. The accumulated kindness of people who owed me nothing, who chose, again and again, to show up in ways my own parents initially refused to. I think the real closure in this story isn't about my parents at all. It's about understanding, finally, at 29 years old, that family isn't only the people who share your blood. It's the people who show up when showing up costs them something, and by that definition, I built a real family in the wreckage of losing the one I was born into. I don't carry the same rage I once did, sitting in my car outside that laundromat at 19, and I don't think that's because I've fully forgiven everything, in the neat, Hollywood sense of the word. I think it's because I've built enough of my own life, on my own terms, that their approval or disapproval no longer holds the power over me that it once did. That, I think, is the actual closure available in a story like this one, not a guarantee that the people who hurt you will get what they deserve, but the freedom of no longer needing them to in order to feel whole yourself. Grace, watching all of this unfold across her 11th year, once asked me if I was happy, genuinely happy, with how everything had turned out, the complicated, partial reconciliation with my parents, the limited, careful reopening of contact with Tyler, the entire messy, imperfect resolution of a story that had once seemed, on that rain-soaked October porch, like it could only end in total ruin. I'm happy, I told her, and I meant it completely. Not because everything got fixed. Some of it never will be. I'm happy because I got to choose, this time, what my life looked like. Nobody chose it for me. And you were with me for every single part of building it. It's been almost 2 years now since that doorbell rang on an ordinary Tuesday evening, and I want to end this story where it matters most, not with a business milestone, not with a dollar figure, but with a single moment that I think captures everything this whole journey was actually about. Last month, we celebrated Grace's 12th birthday, a real party, in the backyard of the home I built entirely on my own. String lights strung between the trees, a cake from the bakery she still loves, and, for the first time, 3 generations of our complicated, rebuilt family gathered together in one place. Sophia and her family, who never once let my shame keep them at a distance. Marcus and his wife, who believed in cedar and sage before it was anything worth believing in. My mother and father, older now, careful and humbled in ways I could never have imagined a decade earlier, and even, for a supervised hour, Tyler, awkward, but genuinely trying, watching his daughter blow out candles for the first time in her life. I stood at the edge of that backyard for a moment, watching all of it, watching my mother laugh at something Grace said, watching my father, leaning on his cane, correctly answer a trivia question Grace's friends had stumped everyone else on, watching Sophia's kids and Grace's friends running through the sprinkler, watching an entire messy, imperfect, hard-won family exist together in one space, and I thought about the girl I used to be, standing on a porch in the rain with a suitcase and $63, utterly unable to imagine that any of this could ever exist for her. I thought, too, about every single hard year in between, the nights in my car behind the laundromat, the walk home in the dark 7 months pregnant, 3 jobs and no sleep and a specific kind of exhaustion I hope none of you listening ever have to experience. The years of silence from the family I once thought would always be there. I thought about how none of that hardship was fair, how 19-year-old me deserved so much better than what her parents gave her, and how, somehow, in spite of all of it, or maybe because of how hard I had to fight through it, I had built a life more genuinely mine than the one they'd once mapped out for me. Grace found me at the edge of the yard during a lull in the party, slightly out of breath from running through the sprinkler, and she wrapped her arms around my waist the way she used to when she was small, and she said, simply, "Best birthday ever, Mom. Thank you for everything." I held my daughter in that backyard, 12 years old now, thriving, secure, surrounded by a family I had built out of the wreckage of the one that failed her before she was even born, and I felt, finally, completely, the thing I had been chasing since that rainy October night, not vindication, not victory over my parents, but something quieter and more permanent than either of those things. Peace. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this: whatever door has closed on you, a family, a relationship, A version of your life you thought was guaranteed. It is possible, even when it feels utterly impossible, to build something real and lasting on the other side of that closed door. It will not be easy. It was not easy for me, not for one single year of the 10 it took. But I promise you, standing where I stand now, that it is possible. To every young mother out there facing a closed door tonight, alone and afraid and certain that no one is coming to help you, I see you. I was you. And I promise, from everything I have lived through to get here, that the story is not over. Keep going. Choose your child. Build the life nobody thinks you can build. 10 years from now, you may be standing in your own backyard, surrounded by a family you built entirely by hand, wondering how you ever survived the version of yourself that once stood on a porch in the rain, believing it was the end. It wasn't the end. It was only the beginning.